Imagine stepping into the woods, the smell of pine and earth filling the air, the chirping of crickets all around, and the comforting silence that only nature can offer. But sometimes the forest isn't as peaceful as it seems. Sometimes, hidden in the shadows, something waits, something unnatural. Tonight I'll be sharing 3 unnerving hiking and camping horror stories that will make you think twice before venturing into the wilderness. Stay with me, and let the terror unfold. These are not just stories, these are real encounters shared by those who dared to enter the woods, and never came out the same. Our first story comes from Sarah, an avid hiker who had always loved exploring the forests of the Pacific Northwest. One weekend, she decided to go on a solo hike through a remote section of the forest, far from the well-trodden paths. Sarah had heard stories of strange things happening in these woods, but she dismissed them as mere local legends. She began her hike at dawn, the sun filtering through the trees in a serene display of light and shadow. But as the day wore on, an uneasy feeling started creeping over her, as if someone were watching her from the underbrush. Every now and then she thought she saw something out of the corner of her eye, a flash of movement too quick to make out, but enough to unsettle her. As dusk approached, Sarah made her way to a small clearing where she intended to set up camp. She unpacked her gear and began to light a fire. The crackling flames cast long shadows across the trees. But then, just as the fire started to roar, Sarah heard something, a low, guttural growl, coming from the woods behind her. Her heart raced as she stood up, scanning the darkened forest. She could hear the soft shuffle of feet moving between the trees, and then, the unmistakable sound of breathing. Not from an animal, but from something much closer, much human. Terrified, Sarah grabbed her flashlight and pointed it toward the noise. For a brief moment, the beam caught the reflection of 2 pale eyes staring at her from behind a tree. They were human eyes, but there was something wrong about them, too wide, too still. Then, just as quickly as they appeared, the eyes vanished and the breathing stopped. Sarah didn't stay around to find out what it was. She grabbed her things and ran, heart pounding in her chest, until she reached the nearest town. She never went back to that forest. Our second story comes from Michael and his friends, a group of avid campers who thought they had seen it all. They had been to many forests, camping in the remote wilderness without incident. But on one fateful trip, something changed. Michael and his group had decided to camp in an isolated part of the forest, far from any hiking trails. They pitched their tents near an old abandoned cabin they found along the way. It had been standing there for decades, its windows broken, its wood rotting, but it was the perfect place to spend the night. As the night fell, the group gathered around the campfire, telling ghost stories and joking around. But when they went to sleep, strange things began to happen. Michael woke up in the middle of the night, hearing faint tapping on the walls of the cabin. He assumed it was just an animal, but when he opened the door to check, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Outside, standing under the dim moonlight, was a figure. A man dressed in ragged clothes with a long beard and a wild, unkempt look. He was staring at Michael without saying a word, his eyes glazed over. The strange man didn't move, didn't blink, just stood there watching them. Michael's instincts screamed at him to run, but he stood frozen, too terrified to move. The man suddenly broke the silence with a low whisper, "You shouldn't have come." Before Michael could react, the man turned and disappeared into the woods. The group packed up in a hurry and they never spoke of it again. Our third story comes from Emily, who was hiking along a well-known trail with her friends. The trail was supposed to be safe, marked clearly with signs and regularly maintained. But that didn't stop the events that unfolded, events that no one could explain. Emily and her friends were nearing the end of the trail when they noticed something unusual. The air seemed thicker, the atmosphere heavy with an unnatural stillness. They heard no birds, no wind, not even the sound of their own footsteps. Then they came across an old, weathered sign. One that hadn't been there before. It read, "Turn back. The forest remembers." Confused but intrigued, they continued on, convinced it was just a joke. But as they moved deeper into the woods, things began to get strange. Shadows flitted at the edge of their vision, and cold spots began to appear. Emily felt a strange compulsion to keep walking, even though her friends were urging her to turn back. And then, they saw it. At the end of the trail stood a cabin, small and dilapidated, almost blending into the trees. But what caught their attention were the people standing outside. Or rather, the figures that looked like people. Only they weren't quite right. Their faces were pale and featureless, their movements jerky, like they were not quite alive. The figures turned to face Emily and her friends, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. And in that moment, Emily knew they had made a terrible mistake. They ran back to the trail, but it seemed to stretch on forever, the cabin's dark silhouette always in the distance. The last thing Emily remembers is the sound of footsteps following them, slowly, methodically, just out of reach. 3 stories, each one rooted in the fear of the unknown. The forest is vast, beautiful, and often serene. But it is also ancient, holding secrets that no one should ever uncover. So next time you find yourself alone in the woods, remember, you are never truly alone. The trees, the shadows, and the things that hide just beyond the light may be watching, waiting. Thanks for joining me tonight. Stay safe out there, and keep your eyes open. You never know what's lurking just beyond the trail. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chilling tales. And remember, some stories are better left untold, but we tell them anyway.